Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hello, and welcome to Reimagining Motion, podcast on the High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, which is undertaking research into the complex and interrelated issue of sustainable transport across Africa and South Asia. The High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, or HVT, is an £80 million investment by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. I'm Holger Dagman, your host for today's session. Welcome to our second series on climate change and transportation in the context of low-income countries. It has become overwhelmingly clear that we are off track to stave off the catastrophic impact of climate change. And with transport contributing to nearly a quarter of all energy-related carbon emissions globally, it's clear that the transport sector is critical to achieving the ambitious Paris Agreement. But the drive to greener and safer transport is a complicated balance with very different challenges for low-income countries compared to wealthy ones. In this series, we are talking to climate and transport experts, including guests from our HVT research program, to explore the opportunities and challenges that low-income countries face in mitigating emissions, adapting of the impact of climate change, and how to find a way to find a just transition to a resilient and low-carbon future. Each episode draws from the latest experts and includes highlights from the HVT research, case studies, and newly developed frameworks offering insights and practical ideas for addressing climate change in a just way in the land transport sector. To help us further explore these issues, I'm very pleased that I can speak today to Yacob Mulugetta. He's a professor of Energy and Development Policy at the University College in London. He is also coordinating lead author of the 5th and 6th assessment report at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, as well as also he is the partnership lead of the Climate Compatible Growth Program, CCG, which is another program funded also by FCDO. And finally, and I stop also the introduction with that, is was also taking part as a co-author of the latest Sunfall report, which was in partnership with HVT and CCG, and was launched at COP27. And it was on e-mobility in Africa, particularly looking into opportunities and challenges around finance, governance, and particular equity. We would like to talk more about this today. So great to see you again. How are you doing?
Hey, Holger. Good to see you.
Thanks for joining. Let's start also. We are just coming also out of COP27. As I mentioned, also that reporters on sustainable mobility for all on electric mobility in Africa also was launched. So tell us a little bit also your initial thoughts in terms of, okay, what is really also the role of e-mobility across Africa, and how would you also define also e-mobility in the context of Africa?
Well, thanks, Holger. I mean, of course, e-mobility for me, the mobility part is the key, meaning, the whole question around meeting transport needs for livelihoods. Perhaps, this is a simple way to define it. Societies are, getting more complex as cities are expanding, getting from A to B in order to be able to fulfill livelihoods needs is becoming even more critical than ever. And of course, the E aspect, which is the electrical aspect of it, comes in. Of course, historically, what has been used and currently as well is we've used all sorts of fossil fuels to service mobility. And so now the question is whether the feasibility of moving towards using electricity, particularly renewable energy as a source of electricity. So this is how I visualize, the whole question of e-mobility. Now, in the context of Africa, it's more complex because, there are issues of equity. When we talk about e-mobility, it's not in the traditional sense of how it's done in Norway, but rather if you're going to really address some of the key transport challenges in African cities, you have to address the whole question of mobility for those who are using public means of transporting themselves. Now, this can be the two-wheelers, the three-wheelers, but also buses. And so this is the real space, if you will, which perhaps potentially appeals to African policymakers to move in that direction of e-mobility. Cities are expanding horizontally, so that requires more transport, and we've seen congestion levels rising, health and social implications that are associated with it. So the issue is there a way to be able to address this question within a broader sort of planning framework in cities?
Thanks for this brilliant answer, Yacob.
So would you say also that there is a risk that is like the green agenda, that is like the low carbon agenda is almost overshadowing also the needs of the most vulnerable in society, so who faces unfair conditions and also really also the access to goods and services through mobility? There is
a risk of that. Of course, it depends on what sort of conversations will happen with city planners and city level policymakers as well as national policymakers. But there is always that risk that in so many of our climate conversations, there seems to be a burden on the poorest to make some of the adjustments, even though they are the least responsible for causing the climate problem. And I think, that's the real danger, that somehow our climate agenda can actually interfere with local development issues. And that those are questions that we have to put on the table, especially if we're talking about inclusivity and just transitions and so forth. Then you have to put people at the center of all decisions in order to be able to achieve benefits that may come from e-mobility or other climate-specific type of interventions. So I think, in a nutshell, what are the co-benefits? The developmental co-benefits of e-mobility, for example, has to be front and center. The climate agenda has to be, an add-on, if you will. So if you are able to articulate the co-benefits for the policymakers, then, you can carry them. If the framing is climate, forget about it. Nothing is going to happen then.
And in fact, the framing starts already that also the real benefits are called as a co-benefit. But I wonder also from your perspective then, as we talked about also the responsibility also of the global north at the same time. So what's needed to support an effective introduction of the e-mobility to make it really as inclusive?
As you just said, provision of services has to be the key driver. The other is, of course, to see what are the key opportunities that come from e-mobility, for example. And here, because, we're talking about double investment here. We're not just talking about transport or changing, the way in which, we do transport, but also energy systems. So I think, there are potential opportunities there in terms of bringing in additional renewable energy for e-mobility and for all other, livelihoods requirements. So I think, the investment opportunity is there, the way in which, countries can move in a greener pathway. But of course, at the heart of it has to be, the framing of providing higher quality services and fulfilling, the key developmental objectives of specific countries. And of course, when we are talking about these types of introducing new ways of doing things, e-mobility, even, renewable energy in some settings, one has to actually ensure that this is context relevant and context specific. It's not going to work in a universal way everywhere.
It brings me also to the next topic. As you as an energy expert, it's often also in the transport world forgotten that e-mobility itself is not necessarily so climate friendly per se, and it requires also that combination out of renewable energy and also transport, which really also brings the potential benefit from the climate as well as from the social and inclusivity aspects and the access aspect in fact. So some people argue in fact, okay, if you now bring in transport also as another burden also for the electricity system, while also in Africa more than 600 million people still also don't have access also to daily electricity in their housing. What is your take here? So is that also e-mobility burden or an opportunity or both?
Yeah, that's a good question, Holger. I know we've kind of talked about this outside of here, and we will continue to talk about it. Look, the electricity requirements across Africa is huge. At the moment, we're talking about 50% of the population has, if at all, even has access. And if you start breaking it down across countries, you've got some countries that have less than 15%, close to 10%. So the need for power, and of course, countries are also, being ambitious about their future developments. So if you take that into account, then the need for power is going to skyrocket. Of course, you also have new types of or new services that are being talked about. All of these will require more power, more energy. And then now when you add electrical mobility to that, then, that does add up. Now, the issue is whether these are all possible simultaneously. Personally, I feel if you have an interconnected or inter-dialogue between sectors, it is achievable. And also the other thing, perhaps, with e-mobility in particular, that what we may see is an enhancement of the quality of the power sector itself. So there are possibilities that by expanding, but by deepening also the need for certain types of power, such as e-mobility, it may serve in, enhancing the quality of power, but also the quantity of it to come through. So it's really important to have a intersectoral dialogue going as a way to sketch out the future of the energy system, but also the future of how sectors are going to be able to use power.
So this is very interesting. So is this kind of dialogue already happening, or what needs to be done to facilitate such a dialogue?
I mean, I don't think, this dialogue is happening in a structured way. Part of it is, countries are almost perennially on a catch-up mode. In a sense, their demands are so heavy that they are essentially crisis management type of mode is what we have. Perhaps, the one that may come closest is in terms of having these intersectoral dialogue is Ethiopia. The reason why I'm saying Ethiopia is because, it's a country that 12 years ago, it came up with its growth and transformation plan, but then a year later came up with its climate resilient green economy program. Pretty ambitious, almost audacious, because it was proposing to grow the economy by 10, 12, 15% without increasing its greenhouse gas emissions. And now, then it pulled together some ideas. For example, the tram system that's built in Addis Ababa is one interesting example where you're using renewable energy electricity, because Ethiopia's electricity is largely renewable, mostly hydro though. But still, and the transport system that was being sketched out was the rail system as well as the tram system was running on electricity. So you have this interesting example where there is a kind of intersectoral sort of action that was taken. Personally, what I think needs to happen is really to bring in the sectors or the sector heads and actually begin to think collectively along with the utilities, to explore how and where and what are the sort of the country's development pathways and how power can be distributed across sectors rather than, find yourself in this winner takes all type of policy. This requires serious sort of dialogue.
You spoke earlier about the low shares of emissions also from lower and middle income countries, but also the responsibility also for higher income countries here, but also more in general, what do you see as responsibility also from the higher income countries? And let's get a little bit back also into e-mobility. What is actually needed? What does some form paper actually say in terms of responsibility here and potential action and support?
I mean, we were at the COP and many previous COPs. Every conversation around transport, around energy, around anything ultimately comes to the whole discussion around finance. We almost always, even our sectoral discussions, end up being discussions about finance. And of course, in 2009, the world had committed to provide, the northern countries had committed to provide, to my mind, I think it was seed money, if you will, the $100 billion. They pledged that. We haven't seen the fulfillment of that money come through. But I think we also know that these are the type of finance that's going to be required is significantly more than that. If we're really serious about a rapid transformation of all systems in each country. So the first key question is, the pledges that countries make need to be delivered. The other is perhaps, creating some collaborations, around knowledge transfer and technology transfer. So there's quite a lot of experience and expertise that can be mobilized from northern countries with the idea of actually transferring knowledge, not necessarily for you and I to go down there and do the job and walk away, but rather, to build a type of internal capacity that countries acquire. But I think, what needs to start happening is serious institutional building to take place in countries as a way to build internal confidence of their systems, but also to be able to build the kind of expertise and skills that will help them face the future, in a sense. So I think, both on the question of finance is key. That needs to be scaled up. We talk about, of course, in the paper, de-risking and blended finance. I think these are important to try and bring in the private sector. But at the same time, I do think, that there is also a need for some public finance to be able to, so that it can stimulate, resources to flow from private actors as well.
Great answer, Yacob.
As I don't want to let you go without also referring also to the science and the work and the contribution you had also to over the years also with the International Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC work. So is there anything particular where you feel, okay, these are really issues when it comes also to transport, which needs to be also addressed far more so COP, but also in general as the countries and society?
What's interesting is that in my view, we're seeing, increasingly the IPCC key messages are beginning to influence some of our discussions. The IPCC talks about rapid transformations across, all systems will be required to avoid the worst climate impacts. The interesting thing is that now, finally, we're seeing the kind of the connection, or at least, the science is beginning to make some headway in the negotiations, and we're seeing some of those outcomes. Now, specific to e-mobility, of course, the IPCC reports chapter on transport is full of it. And to some extent, again, it has in many ways brought some of the great examples that we see in various countries, Norway, Germany, and so forth, but also thinking about, well, how can some of these good practices be brought in to countries that may benefit from it, with all the sort of necessary modifications and context specificity that we have. So I think that maybe I'm a little over-optimistic, but I do see that the politics and the science are beginning to finally talk to each other.
Certainly nice to have an optimistic voice in those times where facing a lot of challenges around the world. So thanks a lot. So I think we heard a lot about also the opportunity for immobility for places in Africa, but it has to be really also in a way also become also inclusive. We also have heard that we need to look into like the energy side as well as the transport side, bringing also renewable in. I'm sure some research and programs like high volume transport and CCG can also to a certain extent also contribute to, and finally also the need also for far more support also from high income countries to bring also equity in to also finance, but also institutional building as well as also capacity, and that we still have a long way to go with COP, but at the same time also the encouraging words in terms of, okay, it's more listeners to science. So any final closing remarks from you before we end with this podcast?
Okay, so I think, when we talk about, because our discussion here also to some extent was reflecting on equity questions. And so when we talk about equity, let's also broaden that discussion to the equity of raising resources, or the need to raise resources from those who are, in a sense, sitting on incredible amount of wealth. And that's really where I'm heading towards. So there is a need to sort of address that global inequality of, how resources are being managed. But then also means that our just transition discussion has to also permeate within countries. So there are also those inequalities within countries. Policymakers, for instance, many of the policymakers tend to make policies, not so much thinking about, people's needs necessarily, but rather, these spurious discussions around growing the economy and then, wealth or rather, benefits will flow from that. So I think when we talk in our discussions about just transition, it has to be both at the global level, but also within countries, because, policies also have to be constructed with people's needs in mind. And that also, of course, includes, what we do with e-mobility and other interventions.
Thank you so much, and also to come also with the closure in terms of really opening up the wide range when we talk about equity from also and inclusiveness from also really also the people on the ground also have to also get also to schools to get food and to get also to work every day in their life in a more safe and affordable and hopefully then it's cleaner as a manner in the future up. So a really wide range, but I think a wonderful players to really take everything into account. Thank you so much for joining me in that podcast, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. Cheers.
So thank you for listening to this episode. If you'd like to find out more about the work of our guests and any of the resources, please check out the links in the description. I also encourage you to listen to the other episodes in the series where we explore a variety of other topics related to climate change and transport. Also, you can leave us a rating, hopefully a good one, and a review. It really helps others find our podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the work of the High Volume Transport, you can check out our website at transport-links.com or follow us on Twitter at transport_links or on LinkedIn at High Volume Transport Applied Research Program. The High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, HVT, is an £18 million investment by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. The program's new body of research aims to help inform decisions of policymakers in low-income countries and make road and rail transport greener, safe, and more accessible and affordable. My name is Holger Dahlmann, and you have been listening to Reimagining Motion. Thank you. Stay and travel safe wherever you are. Goodbye and auf Wiedersehen.